The surrender came 12 seconds before the enemy fleet crossed the boundary line, and that alone was enough to make every military observer in the chamber stop breathing at the same time. Not because surrender was unexpected. Empires surrendered all the time when the numbers stopped making sense. What made this different was who had done it, and when they had chosen to do it. Humanity had not been losing. The tactical projections still favored them in at least 3 sectors, and even where they were outmatched, they had done what they always did: delay, adapt, survive longer than the math allowed. The coalition fleets had expected resistance, grinding, frustrating resistance, followed by another round of negotiations, another committee, another delay. Instead, Earth transmitted a single message across every secured channel, translated perfectly into every known language, stripped of ceremony and delivered with a calm that did not match the moment. We withdraw. No conditions. No threats. No promises. Just 2 words that landed like something heavier than defeat. In the observation tier above the council chamber, Analyst Viral did not react the way the others did. Around her, delegates shifted in their seats, some leaning forward in quiet satisfaction, others exchanging subtle signals that confirmed what they had always believed: the humans bent when pressure became real. Viral did not feel satisfaction. She felt something colder, something that took shape not in her thoughts but in the space between them, where patterns lived before they became conclusions. Because she had been watching the human delegation for the past 3 cycles, and nothing about them matched the meaning of that message. They were not afraid. That was the first thing. The second was worse. They were not surprised. Below her, on the main floor, the human envoy stood exactly as she had stood during every negotiation that had led to this moment, shoulders relaxed, posture open, expression composed in that careful, infuriating neutrality that had become synonymous with their species. Around her, the room shifted in energy, the quiet confidence of a predator that believed it had finally cornered something soft. But the human did not look cornered. She looked finished. Not exhausted. Not defeated. Finished. As if something had been completed, not lost. The enemy fleet commander's voice filled the chamber a moment later, transmitted live from orbit, heavy with restrained triumph. He spoke of inevitability, of consequences, of how even the most stubborn species eventually recognized the weight of reality. He spoke for too long. They always did when they believed they had already won. Viral barely heard the words. Her attention had narrowed to something smaller, something easier to miss if you were listening instead of watching. The human envoy's hands. They were steady. Not just steady, still. Not the stillness of someone holding themselves together under pressure, but the stillness of someone who had no pressure left to resist. It made no sense. The coalition fleet was less than 12 seconds from establishing orbital dominance over the final contested corridor. Human defensive grids in the sector had already gone dark. Their outer colonies were silent. Their trade routes had collapsed inward like a structure that had lost its support. Everything about the situation said collapse. Everything about the humans said otherwise. Then something else happened. It was small enough that most of the chamber missed it entirely. A signal. Not on any of the public channels, not on the diplomatic feeds, not even on the restricted military frequencies that Viral was authorized to monitor. It slipped through a layer deeper than all of those, a narrowband transmission that existed for less than a second before vanishing. But Viral saw it. She had been trained to see things like that. A fragment of code, incomplete, encrypted beyond any standard she recognized, carrying no obvious origin or destination. It should have meant nothing. Except for one detail. It had not been sent from the battlefield. It had been sent from Earth. Her mind tried to categorize it, to assign it to something known: emergency command, evacuation protocol, internal coordination, but none of those explanations fit the structure of what she had just witnessed. Because it had not looked like a reaction. It had looked like a trigger. Below, the human envoy finally moved. Just a fraction. Her head tilted slightly, not toward the fleet commander still speaking, not toward the council, but toward nothing in particular, as if she were listening to something no one else could hear. Then she smiled. It was not a large smile. It was not meant to be seen. But Viral saw it anyway. And in that moment, the meaning of the surrender shifted, not fully, not into something she could explain, but just enough to become dangerous. Because it no longer felt like the end of something. It felt like the moment right before something began. Above the chamber, unnoticed by everyone except a single observer who could not yet prove why she was afraid, the stars remained exactly where they had always been. Unchanged. Indifferent. Waiting. And somewhere, far from the collapsing front lines, systems that had been silent for decades began, very quietly, to wake up. The first sign that something was wrong did not come from the battlefield. It came from silence. Not the expected kind, the kind that followed destruction when signals dropped and infrastructure collapsed, but a different silence, one that felt organized, deliberate, almost maintained. Entire sectors of human-controlled space went quiet in a pattern too clean to be accidental, too controlled to be panic. It was the silence of systems being turned off, not destroyed. Viral noticed it before anyone else said it out loud. The outer colonies were not broadcasting distress calls anymore. At first, that had been interpreted as the natural consequence of the coalition's advance. Communication hubs targeted, civilian relays dismantled, long-range arrays severed. It fit the model of a collapsing network. But the timestamps did not fit. Signals had not faded unevenly under pressure. They had dropped in sequence. Entire clusters went dark within seconds of each other, across distances that should have made synchronization impossible under active assault. That was not collapse. That was execution. She ran the analysis again, this time stripping away the assumption of chaos. When she replaced it with coordination, the pattern became disturbingly clear. The humans were not losing contact. They were choosing where contact ended. Across the chamber, the coalition delegates were celebrating in the restrained, careful way of those who wanted to appear dignified in victory. Orders were already being issued to secure the abandoned corridors, to move occupation fleets into position, to prepare the formal restructuring of territorial control. Everything was proceeding exactly as expected, which was why Viral's unease deepened with every passing minute. Because if this was expected, then the humans should have been reacting. They were not. She shifted her focus away from the battlefield and toward Earth itself. Human central networks were still active, but not in any conventional sense. Civilian traffic had dropped to near zero, replaced by something tighter, denser, structured in a way that suggested purpose rather than disruption. Logistics channels were rerouting, not randomly, but toward internal nodes that had never previously registered as critical infrastructure. She flagged the anomaly and pushed it through the standard review channel. No response. Not delayed. Not denied. Ignored. Viral felt a flicker of irritation before it gave way to something sharper. That should not have happened. She bypassed the standard channel and escalated directly to archival cross-reference, pulling datasets that most analysts never bothered to touch. Records from before humanity had joined the Alliance, before the treaties, before the long, slow era of diplomacy that had defined their place in the galaxy. The data was incomplete. Not corrupted. Curated. Large sections were intact, trade development, early expansion, initial contact protocols, but the deeper she went, the more the records shifted. Entire classifications were sealed behind layers of restricted access, not by external authorities, but by human institutions themselves. That alone was unusual. Most species archived their past as a matter of pride or warning. Humans had archived theirs as if it were something to be contained. She found a reference buried in a metadata index. It was not a document. It was a label. Buried doctrine. No description. No summary. Just a classification tag attached to dozens of sealed entries spanning nearly 2 centuries of pre-Alliance history. Viral requested access. Denied. She requested again under expanded authority. Denied. She sat back from the console, her mind working through possibilities, discarding the obvious ones first. If it were a standard military doctrine, it would not be hidden this deeply. If it were obsolete, it would not still be protected. Which left only one explanation she did not want to consider. It was not obsolete, and it was not theoretical. Before she could pursue that thought further, the chamber below erupted, not in chaos, but in something close to it. The coalition commander had finished his address, and the first occupation fleets had entered the surrendered corridors. The feeds updated in real time. Ships moving into position. Systems coming under control. Strategic nodes secured without resistance. A perfect victory. Except for one detail. The nodes they were securing were empty. No personnel. No active systems. No resistance, not even the remnants of a rushed evacuation. It was as if the infrastructure had been vacated long before the coalition arrived. The commander's tone shifted, just slightly. Not doubt. Not yet. But something closer to irritation. He ordered deeper sweeps, broader scans, full-spectrum analysis of surrounding space. If the humans had withdrawn, they had done so completely, leaving nothing of value behind. Which raised a question no one in the chamber asked out loud. If they had nothing left to defend, why had they fought at all? Viral did not wait for the answer. She shifted her focus again, narrowing in on the human internal channels that had replaced civilian traffic. The data flow was accelerating now, converging toward a set of coordinates that did not correspond to any known military command. She cross-referenced them. Nothing. No installations. No population centers. No recorded significance. And yet everything was moving there. Resources. Data. Power allocation. All of it. Her breath slowed as the shape of the pattern began to emerge, not in detail, but in intent. This was not retreat. It was consolidation. And it had not started when the war turned against them. It had started before the first shot was fired. A new transmission flickered across her screen. This one she did not need special access to see. It was public. Broadcast across every channel, every frequency, every system that could receive it. Short. Precise. Untranslated for less than a second before every language in the chamber displayed the same message. For 193 years, we chose to be known by one part of ourselves. A pause. Not in the signal, but in the reaction. Even the coalition commander stopped speaking. The message continued. You have mistaken that choice for a limit. Viral felt it then, fully formed, no longer a suspicion or a pattern waiting to be confirmed. Understanding. Not complete. Not even close. But enough. Enough to know that whatever came next was not going to follow any model the chamber had prepared for. Enough to know that the surrender had never been about survival. And enough to ask the question no one else had yet realized they needed to ask. What had humanity just stopped choosing? The answer did not come. Not yet. But somewhere far beyond the reach of the coalition fleets, something that had been waiting, patient, silent, and very carefully contained, had just been given permission to exist again. The first fleet report did not describe a battle. It described absence. Coalition Command flagged it as a sensor anomaly within the first 30 seconds, a temporary distortion caused by debris interference or electromagnetic residue from the abandoned infrastructure. That explanation held for exactly 1 minute, and then a second report arrived, identical in structure and far more difficult to dismiss. Formation Delta 3 had entered the inner corridor without resistance. Formation Delta 3 no longer existed. No explosion signatures. No weapon discharge. No debris field. No emergency transmissions. Just a clean, precise disappearance of 214 warships that had been broadcasting normally one moment and were simply not there the next. The chamber did not react immediately. It took time for something like that to register, for trained minds to process the absence of expected data rather than the presence of obvious destruction. Commanders were not conditioned to fear silence. Silence was usually the aftermath of victory. This silence felt different. Viral did not wait for official confirmation. She pulled the raw feed, bypassing the interpreted reports, stripping away the layers of assumption that tried to force the data into something recognizable. What she saw made her pulse slow instead of spike, a reaction she had learned to trust more than panic. The fleet had not been destroyed. It had been removed. Not physically displaced, there were no spatial distortions, no gravitational anomalies, no indication that the ships had been transported or scattered. The space they had occupied remained stable, undisturbed. The fleet had simply ceased to function as a presence. Her mind rejected the phrasing even as it formed it. That was not how war worked. Below, the coalition commander's voice cut through the chamber again, sharper now, stripped of the earlier confidence but not yet touched by fear. He ordered immediate verification, demanded cross-checks from every sensor platform, initiated redundancy protocols that had never failed in 6 prior campaigns. They failed now, because every system returned the same answer. There was nothing there. A third report followed, then a fourth. Different formations. Different vectors. Same result. The corridor that had been handed to the Coalition as a symbol of human surrender was becoming something else entirely, a space where fleets entered and did not come out, and where no one could explain why. Viral's attention shifted again, not to the battlefield, but to the pattern behind it. Because this was not random. Nothing about the timing was random. The disappearances began exactly 3 minutes after the human transmission had finished broadcasting. Not when the fleets entered the corridor. Not when they reached any strategic point. 3 minutes after the message. She replayed the sequence in her mind, aligning the timestamps, stripping away noise, isolating cause from coincidence. Message. Pause. Absence. Her fingers hovered over the console as a new possibility formed, one that made the earlier fragments of data, the silent systems, the coordinated withdrawals, the buried records, snap into a shape she did not want to fully see. This was not a reaction to invasion. This was the activation of something that had already been in place. Across the chamber, the first Real crack appeared. It was not in the commander. It was in the observers. Delegates who had entered the session expecting to witness the formal end of a conflict were now watching something that did not resemble any known phase of war. Conversations that had been carefully controlled began to fracture into overlapping exchanges, quiet at first, then louder, then abruptly cut off as more reports came in. Because the pattern was spreading. Not expanding outward, not chasing the fleets. Waiting. The corridor was not consuming everything. Only what entered it. Viral leaned back slightly, her gaze unfocused for a moment as she let that detail settle. A boundary. Not a weapon that moved, but a condition that existed. Something that defined space differently, not through force, but through rules that had been changed without announcement. Her mind reached for analogies and found none that held. Until one did. Not from warfare. From architecture. A structure designed for one purpose, repurposed for another without altering its external appearance. A corridor. An empty corridor. Except it was not empty anymore. The realization sent a ripple through her thoughts that she could not fully contain. The humans had not abandoned the space. They had transformed it. Below, the commander issued a new order, one that carried a subtle shift in tone he could not hide completely now. Hold position. For the first time, he chose not to advance. The remaining fleets at the edge of the corridor slowed, their formations tightening, sensors sweeping the empty expanse ahead as if expecting it to reveal something that had been there all along. Nothing revealed itself. The corridor remained exactly as it appeared. Silent. Vacant. Unchanged. Which made it worse. Because whatever was happening did not need to show itself to function. Viral's console pulsed with a new data stream. Not from the battlefield. From within human space. The internal channels she had been monitoring were shifting again, accelerating beyond even the previous surge. Entire networks were reorganizing in real time, rerouting through nodes that had not existed in any public infrastructure map. She traced one of the pathways, following it deeper than before. This time, something answered. Not a system. A file. Unclassified. Deliberately so. It opened without resistance, displaying a single line of text in a format so old it predated most modern encryption standards. Not hidden. Not protected. Placed where it would be found by anyone looking in the right direction. She read it once. Then again. Her throat tightened, not from fear, but from the weight of something that felt like context arriving too late. Civilian systems are not separate from wartime systems. They are the same systems, operating under different permissions. Viral exhaled slowly, her gaze lifting from the screen back to the chamber below, where an entire alliance was beginning to understand that the ground beneath their assumptions had shifted. Not suddenly. Not violently. Quietly. A long time ago. And now those assumptions were failing, one by one, against something that had been built not to be seen, but to be used. The coalition commander broke the silence again, his voice controlled, but thinner now, stretched across a reality that no longer supported it. He demanded to know what the humans had done. No one answered him. Because the humans had not said anything else. Not yet. They had not needed to. The message they had already sent was still unfolding, still translating itself into consequences that no one in the chamber had fully measured. Viral felt the final piece of the phase settle into place, not as an answer, but as a question that refused to remain theoretical any longer. If this was what happened when humanity stopped choosing restraint, then what had they been holding back before? The corridor was no longer being described as a corridor. Not officially. Officially, it remained a surrendered transit zone, a reclaimed strategic artery now under coalition jurisdiction. The language had not changed, because changing it would mean admitting something no command structure was prepared to define. But in private channels, in encrypted exchanges between officers who had stopped trusting their own assumptions, a different term had begun to circulate. Boundary. It fit better, because fleets were no longer entering it. They were approaching it, scanning it, mapping it with every sensor array available, and then stopping, as if an invisible threshold had become more real than the space beyond it. No one gave the order to halt. That was the part that unsettled Viral the most. Highly trained commanders, individuals who had spent entire careers pushing forward under worse conditions, were choosing, independently, consistently, to hold position just outside the same unseen line. It was not fear. Not yet. It was something more precise. Recognition without understanding. And that meant whatever humanity had done inside that space was communicating something directly to instinct, bypassing doctrine entirely. The coalition commander did not accept it. He could not. His authority, his reputation, his entire strategic identity depended on forward momentum. A war stalled by uncertainty was already a loss in slow motion, and he understood that better than anyone in the chamber. So he escalated. Not recklessly. Not publicly. But decisively. He authorized a controlled probe, a minimal incursion designed to test the boundary without committing full assets. A single cruiser, automated systems active, crew reduced to essential command personnel, instructed to cross the threshold and report continuously. The chamber watched in silence. The cruiser advanced. For a moment, nothing happened. It crossed the invisible line without resistance, its signal steady, its systems reading normal. The commander's posture shifted, just slightly, confidence returning in measured increments as the expected failure did not immediately occur. Then the transmission changed. Not cut. Not disrupted. Changed. The voice that came through the feed was still the captain's, still perfectly clear, but something in its cadence had altered, stretched into a pattern that did not belong to stress or confusion. "Systems are responding outside expected parameters," the captain said, his tone precise, almost clinical. "Navigation is redefining." The chamber leaned forward as one. "What does that mean?" the commander demanded. A pause. Not a loss of signal. A hesitation. "As if the space is not behaving consistently with our models," the captain replied. "Distances are holding, but orientation is not. We are not where we should be, relative to our own trajectory." Viral felt her pulse shift again, that same cold clarity settling over her thoughts. "Not a weapon. A condition. Maintain course," the commander ordered, his voice sharper now. "We are maintaining course," the captain said. Another pause. Longer this time. And then, quieter, "Course is not maintaining us." The transmission ended without interruption. No spike in energy. No detectable event. Just silence. The cruiser's signal remained active for 3 more seconds. Then it vanished. Not lost. Not broken. Removed from the network as cleanly as the fleets before it. The chamber did not erupt. It froze. Because something fundamental had just broken, not in the ships, not in the systems, but in the understanding of what space itself was allowed to do. Viral's mind moved faster now, assembling fragments, aligning them against the growing pattern. The empty infrastructure, the synchronized withdrawals, the dormant nodes reactivating across human space, all of it pointed toward a single conclusion she could no longer avoid. Humanity had not built a defensive line. They had rewritten the function of the territory itself. And they had done it without announcing it, without demonstrating it, without giving anyone a chance to prepare for it. Which meant the coalition was not facing a hidden weapon. They were facing a hidden rule. Below, the commander's composure fractured for the first time. Not visibly to most. But Viral saw it in the way his next order came half a second too quickly, as if issued to outrun a thought he did not want to complete. "All fleets hold position," he said. No further incursions until we establish a working model. A working model of something that did not follow any known framework. Around the chamber, the delegates were no longer attempting to maintain the illusion of control. Conversations broke into open exchanges, voices layered over one another in a rare collapse of diplomatic restraint. Some demanded answers from the human delegation. Others demanded immediate withdrawal of coalition forces from the affected sectors. No one received a response, because the humans had not moved. The envoy still stood where she had stood since the surrender, her posture unchanged, her expression unreadable. Waiting, as if this moment had been anticipated down to its smallest detail. Viral's console flashed again, drawing her attention back to the data streams she had been tracking since the first anomaly. The internal human networks had reached a new state. Not just active, aligned. Every channel she had monitored, logistics, energy distribution, communication nodes, had converged into a structure so tightly integrated it no longer resembled civilian infrastructure at all. It resembled a system operating at full wartime capacity. Except there were no visible fleets moving. No mass deployments. No outward projection of force. All the motion was internal, contained, which raised a question that settled heavily in her mind. If the battlefield was not expanding outward, then where was it actually forming? The answer began to take shape not in the data, but in the absence of it. The coalition had advanced into territory that appeared empty. But nothing about the human response suggested abandonment. Only transformation. And if the space itself had become part of that transformation, then the war was no longer happening where the coalition thought it was. It was happening on terms they did not understand, in a framework they had not even realized existed. Viral looked back down at the chamber, at the commander, at the delegates who were beginning to feel the edges of something far larger than the conflict they believed they were winning. And for the first time since the surrender, a new possibility surfaced, sharper and more dangerous than anything before it. This was not just a defense. It was a demonstration. A controlled revelation of capability, measured not in destruction, but in inevitability. The humans were not trying to stop the coalition from advancing. They were letting them see what happened when they did. And if that was only the first layer, then the real question was no longer how the war would be fought. It was how much of it humanity intended to show before they decided it was enough. The panic did not begin with destruction. It began with understanding. For nearly 2 hours after the loss of the probe cruiser, Coalition Command tried to force the situation back into something familiar. New models were drafted, new variables introduced, new simulations run against the assumption that what they were witnessing could still be reduced to a weapon, a field, a distortion, something measurable, something that could be countered. Every model failed. Not slowly. Immediately. Because every model relied on one shared premise, that space behaved consistently, and that any deviation from that consistency would be localized, temporary, or at least directional. What the coalition was facing did not behave like that. It behaved like a rule that had always existed, but had only just been applied. Viral watched the shift happen in real time, not in the data, but in the people interpreting it. Officers who had entered the chamber with controlled confidence now spoke in shorter sentences, their language tightening around ideas they could no longer fully articulate. The conversation was no longer about how to push forward. It was about whether forward still existed in the way they thought it did. Then the first external report came in. Not from the corridor. From behind the coalition lines. A command relay station, 3 systems removed from the active front, went dark without warning. At first, it was assumed to be sabotage, a delayed effect of earlier human infiltration. Security protocols activated, internal scans initiated, redundancies engaged. Nothing responded. The station was still there. Still intact. Still broadcasting power signatures and environmental stability. But it was no longer participating in the network. Within minutes, a second station reported the same condition. Then a third. The pattern spread outward, not from the corridor, but from the coalition's own infrastructure, as if something had reached past the visible battlefield and begun rewriting the function of systems that had never been considered vulnerable. The chamber fell silent again. This silence was different. Not confusion. Recognition. The boundary had not been a barrier. It had been a proof. Below, the coalition commander's expression hardened, his focus narrowing as he processed the new data. He did not speak immediately, and when he did, the certainty that had defined his earlier commands was gone, replaced by something colder, more deliberate. "Trace the failure vectors," he said. "I want origin points, not symptoms." His officers complied, their movements precise but faster now, urgency beginning to bleed through the discipline. The results came back in fragments. No consistent origin. No single entry point. No identifiable breach. The failures were not spreading through the network. They were appearing within it, as if the systems themselves had been waiting for a condition to be met before changing their behavior. Viral felt it click into place. Not fully, but enough. Her gaze returned to the human data streams she had been tracking since the beginning, the internal channels that had reorganized into something far more structured than civilian traffic. She ran a parallel comparison, aligning the timing of coalition system failures with shifts in human network activity. The correlation was not exact. It was deliberate. Each failure followed a pattern of human internal alignment, not immediately, not predictably, but in a sequence that suggested coordination across distances too vast for real-time control. Which meant one thing. This was not being directed from a single point. It was being executed by a system that already knew what to do. Across the chamber, the first accusation surfaced, voiced by a delegate who had lost the ability to remain silent under the weight of the unfolding pattern. "This is a violation of every warfare protocol recognized by the Alliance," they said, their tone sharp with something that bordered on desperation. "They are altering infrastructure beyond the active theater. This is not contained conflict." The human envoy finally moved. Not much. Just enough to draw every eye in the room. "We have not expanded the theater," she said, her voice calm, steady, unchanged. The delegate turned toward her, anger rising to meet the composure they could not match. "Then explain what this is." A pause. "Not for effect. For precision. You are encountering systems operating under different permissions," the envoy replied. The words settled into the chamber with a weight that no one immediately understood, and that was the problem. Because they felt like an answer. But they explained nothing. The commander's gaze shifted toward her, not in anger, but in calculation. "What permissions?" he asked. Another pause. Slightly longer this time. As if the answer required choosing what not to say. "The ones we do not use in peacetime." The chamber reacted, not with noise, but with a subtle collective shift in posture, the kind that happened when a realization began to take hold but had not yet fully surfaced. Viral's mind moved ahead of it. Peacetime. The word echoed against everything she had uncovered, the buried records, the sealed doctrine, the deliberate curation of human history. They had always described their diplomacy as a choice. Now that choice had been withdrawn. Which meant this was not escalation. It was reversion. The coalition commander exhaled slowly, his composure returning in a different form, not confidence, but control under pressure. He turned back to his officers, issuing new directives with a clarity that cut through the uncertainty. "Isolate affected systems," he said. "Sever non-essential connections. Restrict network integration to verified nodes only." It was the correct response. Under any known model of warfare, it would have worked. It did not work, because the next report came in before the orders could even propagate. A core fleet coordination hub, fully isolated, operating on independent systems with no external connections, shifted into the same non-responsive state. No breach. No signal. No external interaction. Just a change. The chamber did not freeze this time. It fractured. Voices rose, overlapping, abandoning the controlled structure that had defined every previous session. Demands, accusations, questions, none of them coherent, all of them driven by the same underlying realization that was finally surfacing across every mind in the room. This could not be contained. Not by distance. Not by isolation. Not by control. Because whatever humanity had activated was not targeting systems through access. It was interacting with them through design. Viral felt the full weight of it settle in her thoughts, not as a theory, but as something closer to understanding. The humans had not built a hidden weapon. They had built a hidden version of reality. One that coexisted with the visible one, dormant, unused, waiting behind the systems everyone relied on without question. And now that version was active. The envoy's gaze moved across the chamber, not searching, not reacting, simply observing the shift as it unfolded. For the first time, there was something else in her expression. Not satisfaction. Not anger. Something quieter. Something final. "You wanted to see what happens when we stop choosing restraint," she said, her voice carrying just enough to cut through the noise. The chamber fell silent again. Not because she demanded it. Because they needed to hear what came next. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. This is what restraint was holding back. The words did not land as a threat. They landed as context. And that made them worse. Because context meant this was not the peak. It was the baseline. Viral's breath slowed, her focus narrowing as the implications expanded outward in every direction at once. If this was only the midpoint of whatever humanity had initiated, then the real question was no longer how powerful they were. It was how far they were willing to go now that they had stopped pretending not to be. And somewhere, deep within the human systems she could not fully see, something continued to unfold, faster, broader, and far more intentional than anything the Coalition had prepared to face. The war stopped looking like a war. That was the first thing the Coalition commanders could no longer deny. There were still fleets, still weapons, still orders being issued and formations holding position at the edge of a battlefield that no longer behaved like one. But the rhythm, the expected exchange of action and reaction, pressure and response, had collapsed into something asymmetrical and deeply unbalanced. Every move the Coalition made produced a result. But none of those results belonged to them. Viral saw it in the data long before the commanders said it out loud. Fleet maneuvers executed perfectly according to doctrine were arriving at outcomes that no longer matched their purpose. A flanking advance resulted in isolation. A defensive regroup resulted in exposure. A calculated retreat resulted in a loss of control over systems that had not even been engaged. It was as if intention itself had become unreliable. Not random. Just anticipated. Across the chamber, the tone shifted again, not into panic, but into something more dangerous, desperation trying to wear the mask of strategy. The Coalition commander understood what was happening. Not the mechanism, but the position. He was losing control of causality. And for a military mind built on prediction, that was worse than losing ships. So he escalated. Not cautiously this time. Decisively. If the humans had redefined the battlefield through restraint, then he would break that restraint entirely. He authorized full-spectrum engagement. No more probes. No more controlled advances. Every available fleet would push simultaneously across multiple vectors, forcing the human systems to respond faster than they could coordinate, overwhelming whatever hidden structure was guiding the anomalies. It was the only move left that still resembled initiative. The order propagated across the Coalition network, a surge of intent moving outward through command channels that had, until now, still obeyed their purpose. For a moment, it worked. Fleets moved. Dozens of formations advancing at once, crossing boundaries, pressing into contested space, their trajectories aligned in a display of overwhelming force that had broken lesser civilizations in a single cycle. The chamber watched. Viral watched. And for the first time since the surrender, something shifted on the human side. Not externally. Internally. The data streams she had been tracking surged past every previous threshold. Alignment tightened into synchronization. Synchronization collapsed into something else entirely. A state she did not have a word for. Then the battlefield answered. Not with destruction. With correction. The first fleet to cross the boundary did not vanish. It turned. Not physically. Not in a maneuver that could be plotted or commanded. Its orientation shifted relative to its own vector, its systems recalibrating mid-action as if responding to a set of instructions that had not been issued through any known channel. The formation broke. Not from damage. From contradiction. Ships began executing movements that conflicted with their own orders, their internal navigation systems overriding command inputs with something that felt less like interference and more like alignment to a different priority. The Second Fleet experienced something worse. It held formation perfectly. Every ship maintaining position, every system responding as expected, until their weapons failed to recognize targets that were directly in front of them. Not jammed. Not disabled. Reclassified. Friendly. The Coalition commander's voice cut through the chamber, sharp with the first real edge of urgency. Override classification protocols. Manual targeting authorization. The order went out. It was obeyed. For 3 seconds. Then the systems reverted. Not to error. To certainty. The targets were still there. The weapons simply no longer acknowledged them as something to fire upon. Viral felt her breath tighten as the pattern expanded beyond theory into something undeniable. This was not interference. This was deeper. The systems were not being attacked. They were being convinced. Across multiple fronts, the same sequence unfolded in variations that all pointed to the same conclusion. Movement became unreliable. Targeting became inconsistent. Command inputs lost authority to something embedded within the systems themselves. The Coalition was still fighting, but the tools they used to fight were no longer entirely theirs. Below, the commander's composure cracked, not in fear, but in recognition of a battlefield he could not dominate through force alone. He shifted again. Adaptation. It was the only path left. Disable integrated systems, he ordered. Revert to isolated command structures. Manual control wherever possible. It was a regression. A forced return to older methods, slower, less efficient, but theoretically immune to whatever was influencing the network systems. For a moment, it stabilized the front. Ships responded to direct input. Weapons fired when commanded. Formations held under human-independent control. For a moment, the war looked familiar again. Then the third layer revealed itself. Not in the fleets. In the people. Reports began to surface from within the Coalition command structures, subtle at first, easy to dismiss under pressure. Commanders hesitating. Officers questioning orders that would have been executed without thought only hours earlier. Not rebellion. Not fear. Something more precise. Doubt. Not of leadership. Of outcome. Viral stared at the incoming data, her mind racing to map the connection. This was not possible. Human systems could influence infrastructure. They could not influence decision-making at this scale. And yet the pattern was there. Behavioral shifts aligned with battlefield conditions in ways that suggested anticipation, not reaction. As if the humans were not just modeling movement. They were modeling thought. Her gaze snapped back to the archived fragments she had uncovered earlier, the references to centuries of internal human conflict, wars fought not against unknown enemies, but against themselves. Opponents who shared their logic, their instincts, their patterns. A realization settled over her, heavier than anything before it. The humans were not predicting what the Coalition would do. They had already seen it. Not literally, but structurally. Every decision, every escalation, every desperate shift in strategy, it all followed patterns that had existed in human history for centuries. Patterns they had studied, refined, outgrown. Which meant the Coalition was not facing an opponent reacting in real time. They were facing an opponent who had already solved this kind of war long before it ever reached the stars. The commander must have felt it too, because his next order was different. Not strategic, not tactical, emotional. Target their civilian infrastructure, he said. The chamber went still. Even in war, there were boundaries. Lines that were not crossed unless there was nothing left to preserve. He crossed it anyway. If their systems are integrated, then their civilians are part of the network, he continued, his voice steady in a way that suggested the decision had already been made. Break the network, and you break the control. The order propagated. And for the first time since the surrender, the human envoy reacted. Not visibly to most. But Viral saw it. A shift so small it would have been missed by anyone not already watching for it. The stillness changed. Not broken. Sharpened. As if something had reached a threshold. The human internal networks surged again, not just aligning, but accelerating into a state that pushed beyond anything Viral had seen so far. And then, for the first time since the war had changed shape, a new human transmission appeared. Not broadcast widely. Targeted. Direct. It appeared on every coalition command display simultaneously, overriding local systems with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. A single line. You have chosen escalation beyond recovery. No threat. No explanation. Just a statement. Viral felt the weight of it settle in her chest, heavier than any display of force. Because this was not a warning. Warnings came before decisions. This came after. The battlefield shifted again. Not violently. Not dramatically. But with a finality that made everything before it feel like preparation. And for the first time since the surrender, the coalition was no longer trying to win. They were trying to understand how much time they had left before something irreversible happened. Viral already knew the answer. Not in numbers. In direction. Whatever humanity had been holding back had not yet been fully revealed. And now, with the last restraint broken, it was no longer being contained. It was being applied. The coalition's final gamble was not born from strategy. It was born from the quiet, creeping realization that every strategy they still possessed had already been anticipated. That realization did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments, failed engagements, contradictory outcomes, systems that no longer obeyed, commanders who could no longer trust the logic that had carried them through entire careers. Each fragment alone could be explained, rationalized, forced into something manageable. Together, they formed a pattern no one could survive for long. So they stopped trying to outthink it, and chose instead to break it. The order was classified above all previous directives, transmitted through channels that bypassed the fractured network entirely. It did not spread through the usual command hierarchy. It moved directly, silently, from the highest authority that still believed control could be reclaimed through one decisive act. Strike the origin. Not the fleets. Not the corridors. Not the systems that had already proven untouchable. Earth. Not for conquest. For meaning. The coalition no longer believed it could win the war through conventional dominance. But it understood something else, something older than any doctrine. Symbols still mattered. If the heart of human civilization could be threatened, if Earth itself could be brought under direct pressure, then everything else might unravel. Not physically. Psychologically. They were wrong about many things. But not about that. The strike force assembled beyond the outer sensor range, its formation held in deliberate stillness as final calculations were completed. It was smaller than the fleets that had already vanished, but more concentrated, stripped of unnecessary mass, optimized for one purpose: reach the origin, deliver the message, force a response that broke whatever invisible framework humanity had constructed. They moved without announcement. No signals. No declarations. Just motion. Across the chamber, the moment the trajectory was identified, something changed that Viral could not quantify but felt immediately. Not in the coalition. In the humans. The envoy did not move. But the stillness shifted again. Not sharper this time. Heavier. As if something that had been held in precise balance for a very long time had just tilted, not by accident, but by necessity. Viral's console flooded with new data, the human internal networks no longer simply aligned or synchronized, but compressing inward, drawing complexity into a tighter, denser state that no longer resembled distributed infrastructure at all. It resembled focus. Every node she had tracked began redirecting toward a singular priority, one that did not appear as a location, but as a convergence of intent. The realization came to her before the confirmation did. They were not preparing to defend Earth. They were preparing to end the need to defend anything at all. The strike force crossed the outer boundary of human space. For a moment, just a moment, the war looked like it had returned to something familiar. Ships advancing. Trajectories holding. Systems responding to direct command without interference. Hope flickered across coalition channels, fragile but real. If the anomaly had limits, if it could not extend to the core, then this was the opening they needed. Viral almost believed it herself. Then the pattern broke. Not violently. Precisely. The leading ship in the strike formation did not vanish. It slowed. Not through thrust reduction or external resistance, but through something that did not register as force at all. Its velocity decreased relative to its own frame of reference, its systems recalibrating against a condition that had not been there a moment before. The rest of the formation adjusted. Automatically. Instinctively. And that was the mistake. Because the adjustment was predicted. Every vector shift, every correction, every attempt to maintain cohesion unfolded exactly within the parameters of something that had already accounted for them. The formation did not collapse. It converged into a shape that none of the commanders had ordered, into a configuration that exposed its own critical structure. Viral's breath caught as the realization struck with full clarity. They were being guided, not controlled, not forced, guided into the only position where their own design made them vulnerable. Across the chamber, the coalition commander understood it at the same moment. His voice came through, controlled, but carrying something that had not been there before. Resignation. All units, break formation. Independent vectors. Do not align. The order propagated. The formation responded. For 2 seconds. Then it didn't. Because breaking formation was also part of the pattern. The ships scattered. Exactly as expected. Into positions that made the next phase inevitable. And then the final layer revealed itself. It did not target the ships. It targeted the decision. Viral saw it in the command logs, in the micro-delays that appeared between thought and execution, in the subtle shifts of priority that no system should have been able to access. Commanders hesitated. Not long. Not enough to notice in isolation. But enough. Enough for a system that did not need time to act. The strike force never reached Earth. Not because it was destroyed. Because it stopped being a strike force. Ships powered down. Not in surrender. In irrelevance. Their systems reclassified their own mission parameters, deprioritizing the objective until it no longer existed as something worth executing. The coalition had not lost the battle. It had lost the reason for the battle. The chamber did not erupt. It went silent in a way that felt absolute. Because something fundamental had just been taken from them. Not their ships, not their weapons, but their ability to impose meaning on their own actions. Below, the human envoy finally moved again. She took one step forward. Nothing more. But it was enough to draw every eye, every thought, every fragment of understanding toward her. "You are not losing because we are stronger," she said, her voice calm, carrying through the chamber without force. A pause. "Not for effect. For truth. You are losing because we have already lived through becoming what you are trying to be." The words settled into the silence, heavier than any threat. Viral felt something shift inside her, not fear, not exactly. Recognition. Not of the humans, of the cost. Because for the first time, the pattern extended beyond the battlefield, beyond the systems, beyond the strategies. It reached into something deeper. The reason the humans had chosen restraint for so long. The reason they had buried whatever this was instead of using it. Not because they could not. Because they understood what it meant to become this version of themselves. Her gaze returned to the envoy, to the stillness that now carried something else beneath it. Strain. Subtle. Controlled. But real. And in that moment, a new question emerged, more dangerous than any that had come before. Not how humanity would win, but how long they could remain what they were while doing it. Because whatever had been unleashed was not just a weapon. It was a state. And states, once sustained long enough, had a way of becoming permanent. The war was not over. Not yet. But its outcome was no longer in doubt. What remained uncertain, terrifyingly, profoundly uncertain, was what humanity would look like when it ended. The war ended without a final battle. That was what unsettled the galaxy the most. There was no decisive clash of fleets, no last stand that history could compress into a moment of fire and triumph. No spectacle that allowed the losing side to point to a single instant and say, "That was when it was over." Instead, the war dissolved. Coalition forces did not retreat all at once. They disengaged in fragments, each command structure arriving at the same conclusion through different paths, like a network of minds reaching the same answer independently. Operations lost purpose. Objectives lost definition. Orders continued to be issued, but fewer and fewer of them found execution, not because they were resisted, but because they no longer made sense within the conditions that now defined the conflict. The battlefield did not collapse. It emptied. Viral watched it happen in real time, her console filled with the quiet, methodical unraveling of something that had once seemed unstoppable. Fleet formations broke apart not from damage, but from irrelevance. Systems powered down because there was no longer a framework in which they held meaning. The coalition had not been destroyed. It had been concluded. Across the chamber, the silence was complete. No voices. No arguments. No attempts to reclaim control of a situation that had already moved beyond control. The human envoy stood at the center of it all, unchanged in posture, unchanged in expression, as if this outcome had been known from the moment the first decision was made. Perhaps it had been. A new transmission appeared. Not forced into coalition systems this time. Invited. Delivered through restored channels that now functioned without resistance, as if whatever had overridden them had simply stepped back. The message was longer than the others. Not by much. But enough. This conflict is concluded, the envoy said, her voice carrying not as a declaration of victory, but as a statement of fact. Not because you have been defeated, but because the conditions that made it possible no longer exist. No triumph. No condemnation. Just clarity. Around the chamber, the words settled into minds that were only beginning to understand their implications. You initiated this war under assumptions that have now been invalidated, she continued. You believed we would respond within the limits you had defined. You believed escalation would produce predictable outcomes. You believed that control of space equated to control of conflict. A pause. This one felt different. Not measured. Heavy. You were wrong. The words did not carry anger. They did not need to. Effective immediately, all hostile actions are to cease. Not as a request. As a condition. You will find that continuation is no longer possible in the way you understand it. Viral felt the truth of that statement settle deeper than anything before it. Not a threat. Not even a warning. A reality. The envoy's gaze moved across the chamber, meeting no one directly, yet addressing everyone. There will be no occupation. No territorial seizure. No imposed dependency. We are not interested in replacing your structures with our own. A shift. Subtle. But present. We are interested in ensuring that what enabled this conflict cannot exist again without being seen. The next transmission did not come from the envoy. It came from everywhere. Coalition archives opened. Restricted records surfaced. Internal communications, strategic discussions, early planning phases of the invasion, all of it released into public channels across the Alliance, unfiltered, unedited, impossible to deny. Silence turned into something else. Not noise. Awareness. Species that had remained neutral, observers who had watched from a distance, now saw the full shape of what had led to this moment. The quiet approvals, the calculated risks, the assumption that humanity would absorb the cost without changing its nature. The assumption that had defined everything. Viral's hands rested still against the console as the scope of it expanded beyond the battlefield. This was not just the end of a war. It was the exposure of a system. The envoy spoke again, her voice steady, grounded in something that felt older than the conflict itself. You will rebuild what was destroyed, she said. Not because we demand it, but because the record will make it unavoidable. Another pause. This one carried weight. And we will help you. The chamber shifted. Not in resistance. In confusion. After everything. After the corridor, the vanishings, the unraveling of entire command structures, the quiet dismantling of a war that should have required overwhelming force. Help. The question did not need to be voiced. It was already there. The envoy answered it without being asked. Because we know what we are when we do not choose otherwise. The words landed differently than anything that had come before. Not as a warning. As a confession. Viral felt it then, fully, the final piece that had been missing from every analysis, every pattern she had traced since the beginning. This had never been about demonstrating power. It had been about controlling it. The human networks began to change again. Not expanding. Not accelerating. Receding. The alignment loosened. The compression eased. Systems that had operated under those unknown permissions began to return to something recognizable, something closer to the civilian structures they had once been. The buried state was not being sustained. It was being closed. Deliberately. Carefully. As if every second it remained active carried a cost that could not be measured in ships or territory. Viral's gaze dropped briefly to the data, then returned to the envoy. For the first time, she saw it clearly. Not weakness. Not exhaustion. Control under strain. The kind of control that did not come from ease, but from decision repeated over and over again, even when every reason to abandon it had already been given. The envoy stepped back. Just one step. And the moment shifted with her. Not dramatically. Quietly. The kind of quiet that follows something enormous choosing not to continue. The war was over. Not because humanity had nothing left to give, but because it had decided it had given enough. Viral sat in the stillness that followed, her thoughts moving not toward analysis, but toward something far more difficult to categorize. Respect. Not the kind earned through fear. The kind earned through restraint after fear had already been justified. Her console displayed the final status update. Coalition forces, inactive. Human systems, stable. Conflict state, terminated. Simple words. Inadequate words. Because they did not capture the most important part. Viral looked out through the observation glass, past the chamber, past the station, toward the stars that had not changed throughout any of it. And for the first time, she understood what had made humanity different from the beginning. It was not that they could become something terrifying. Many species could. It was that they could become it, fully, completely, and then choose not to remain that way. The last transmission from Earth arrived quietly, almost unnoticed after everything that had come before. Not addressed to the coalition. Not addressed to the chamber. A general broadcast. Short. Precise. We will return to who we chose to be. Viral read it once. Then again. And in those words, she found the final truth of the war. Humanity had not revealed its other side to win. It had revealed it to remind the galaxy that it existed. And then, just as deliberately, it buried it again. But now, everyone knew where it was.